The Johnson home sat quietly at the end of Maplewood Lane, nestled between old oak trees and neighbors who smiled politely but kept to themselves. It was the kind of street where nothing really changed. Lawns stayed trimmed, porch lights flickered on at sunset, and the occasional mail carrier stopped for a quick hello. Inside the little blue house, Emily and Mark Johnson were preparing for a life that was about to be anything but ordinary. Emily had always dreamed of becoming a mother. Every corner of the nursery had been carefully planned. The soft yellow walls were lined with painted clouds, a handmade mobile spun slowly above the crib, and shelves were filled with storybooks waiting to be read. Mark, a quiet man who worked in it, built the crib himself. It creaked slightly when he pressed on it, but Emily loved that. It felt real. Their excitement was gentle, grounded. They weren't the type to post daily baby bump updates or throw extravagant showers. They just wanted a peaceful life with their baby, a simple, warm beginning. When Emma was born, everything changed. At first, the delivery seemed typical. Nurses smiled, doctors gave reassurances, and Mark held Emily's hand while whispering that everything would be okay. But moments after Emma arrived, the room grew quiet. Too quiet. Doctors spoke in hushed tones. A pediatric neurologist was called in. Tests were run before Emily had even held her daughter. The diagnosis came later that evening, wrapped in medical terms and printed pages. Spinal muscular atrophy, type 1. A rare condition. Progressive. No cure. Emma would likely never sit up on her own, never walk, and might not live past early childhood. Emily stared at the ceiling in the hospital room while holding her tiny daughter for the first time. Emma's eyes were open, calm. Her fingers curled slightly, as if grasping at something just out of reach. She was beautiful, fragile, but perfect. Mark didn't say much. He didn't cry in front of the doctors. But when he saw the wheelchair-friendly crib catalog left on the nurse's desk, he looked away quickly, pretending not to notice. The ride home from the hospital was silent. No welcome balloons, no family crowding the porch. Just two parents holding onto each other a little tighter, their newborn sleeping in a carrier between them. But even in the heaviness of it all, they'd made a quiet decision. If Emma's time here would be short, it would be full. Full of music, of sunlight through the windows, of bedtime stories and warmth. They would give her every beautiful thing they could, even if they didn't know what tomorrow might bring. It had all started when Emily and Mark were walking through the local shelter one autumn afternoon. They weren't necessarily looking for a cat, but when they passed the cages, they both stopped. One cat, in particular, caught their attention. He wasn't the biggest, the fluffiest, or the most strikingly beautiful. In fact, his fur was a little scruffy, his eyes a strange mix of green and amber, and his tail twitched restlessly, as though he couldn't sit still for long. But there was something about him, something calm, like he knew things others didn't. The shelter worker smiled as they approached. "This is Whiskers. He's a bit older than most of the kittens we have, but he's been here a while. Seems like he's waiting for the right person." Emily bent down, and Whiskers immediately walked over, brushing against her hand as if he knew exactly who she was. She glanced at Mark. There was a moment of understanding between them. No words, just a quiet knowing that this was the cat they were meant to bring home. It didn't take much longer for them to finalize the paperwork and head out with their new family member. Whiskers was quiet during the ride home, curling up on the back seat as if it was all perfectly normal. He had a slight limp, a relic of an old injury, but he seemed to move through the world with a quiet grace. No jumping, no chasing, just a peaceful presence that filled whatever space he was in. Back at the Johnson home, Whiskers made himself at home quickly. He explored every corner, found his favorite spots to nap, and settled in. But there was something else about him that neither Emily nor Mark could put into words. It was as if Whiskers knew he had a purpose, and his purpose was clear. He would be there for Emma. In the first few weeks after Emma's birth, it was Whiskers who seemed to sense the changes before anyone else did. When Emma was restless, Whiskers would hop onto her crib's edge and lie there, purring gently, soothing her in a way no one else could. When Emma cried, the cat would approach her, almost as though he understood the difference between hunger and pain, between restlessness and distress. He wasn't just a pet. He was a companion, a quiet guardian who moved through the house like a shadow, watching over his little human. And no one, not even Emily or Mark, realized just how much Whiskers would come to matter. In the weeks that followed Emma's arrival home, life settled into a new rhythm. The constant doctor's appointments, the therapies, the midnight feedings, it was overwhelming at times. But there was one constant: Whiskers. He was always there, moving between rooms as if he had a schedule of his own. He would often settle on the couch, his eyes half-lidded in contentment, but no matter where he was, his attention never wavered from the baby. His days seemed to revolve around Emma, and his nights, too, were filled with quiet vigilance. The first time Emily noticed something different was when she was sitting beside Emma's crib, gently humming a lullaby as she rocked the baby to sleep. The house was silent, save for the soft sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Whiskers, who had been lounging in the living room, stood up abruptly and padded over to the crib. He jumped up, surprising Emily, and nestled himself against the bars. He didn't meow, didn't nudge or push. He just sat there, perfectly still, watching over Emma. At first, Emily thought it was simply a coincidence, but over the following days, she noticed the pattern. Whenever Emma stirred or made any noise, Whiskers was there. His presence was a calming one, and Emma, though unable to move much, seemed to sense it. Her tiny hands would flutter, her lips would curl upward in the faintest smile, and her eyes, wide and bright, would track the cat as he moved beside her. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Whiskers never climbed into the crib. He knew better, but he would lie right next to it, his body forming a silent boundary between Emma and the world. He seemed to understand her limitations, and in his own way, he created a sense of safety for her, one that no one else could offer. It wasn't that he was simply a comforting presence. There was something more. Whiskers was intuitive, sensing when Emma was restless, when she needed something, when she was at peace. Emily smiled as she watched him one afternoon, curled up next to the crib. She had never seen a cat like him before, so patient, so gentle. It was as if Whiskers knew his role in their family, and he was determined to fulfill it. To Emily, it became clear. Emma and Whiskers shared a bond that went beyond just pet and child. Something deeper, unspoken, and perhaps even miraculous. And for the first time since Emma's birth, Emily allowed herself to believe in the possibility of miracles. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Emma and Whiskers deepened in a way that both perplexed and comforted Emily and Mark. It wasn't just a typical pet-child relationship. There was something almost mystical about it, something neither of them could easily put into words. Emma, despite her condition, was an alert and curious baby. She couldn't move or sit up on her own, but her eyes always seemed to follow whatever caught her interest, and nothing seemed to capture her attention quite like Whiskers. It was almost as if she recognized something in him. Her gaze would shift toward him whenever he was nearby, and her tiny hands would reach out, trembling with the effort. Mark often joked that Emma was trying to pat the cat, though it was obvious she couldn't quite get her fingers to touch him. But the more Emily observed, the more she became convinced that it was more than just fascination. Emma seemed to feel Whiskers in a way she didn't feel anything else. When Whiskers curled up near her, she'd calm almost instantly. When he was in the room, her breathing would steady, and a serene expression would cross her face. It wasn't just the comfort of his presence. It was as if Whiskers was offering her something deeper, something she couldn't access on her own. One afternoon, Emily was sitting on the couch, gently rocking Emma in her arms, when Whiskers jumped up beside them. He sat just close enough that his fur brushed against Emily's hand. Emma, still in her mother's arms, stirred slightly, then turned her head toward the cat. The two of them, baby and cat, locked eyes for a brief moment. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt significant. Something passed between them, a kind of unspoken understanding, as though Whiskers was silently telling Emma that he was there for her always. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of awe in that moment. It was as if Whiskers had become more than just a pet. He was her daughter's quiet protector, her confidant in a world that was often overwhelming and unpredictable. But there was no way to explain it. No way to share this miracle with anyone who hadn't seen it firsthand. Whiskers didn't do anything extraordinary. He didn't perform tricks or make grand gestures. He simply existed, calm, steady, and ever-present. And somehow, that was enough. For the first time since Emma's birth, Emily felt a small, fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. It was a quiet afternoon in the Johnson home, the kind of peaceful day that seemed to slip by unnoticed. The rain had started falling softly against the windows, creating a gentle rhythm that filled the house with a calm ambience. Emily was in the kitchen, folding laundry, while Mark was in the living room, reading a book. Emma, as always, was peacefully napping in her crib. Whiskers, who had spent most of the morning lounging in the sunniest spot of the living room, was now perched on the windowsill, his gaze focused outside. His ears twitched occasionally as the wind picked up, but otherwise, he seemed content in his quiet world. Suddenly, without any warning, Whiskers sprang into action. He jumped down from the windowsill with a speed and urgency that Emily had never seen from him before. His body was stiff, his fur bristling slightly as he padded quickly toward Emma's crib. There was no mewing, no hesitation, just a sudden, intense focus. Emily glanced up, thinking it was nothing more than the cat being playful, but as she saw Whiskers stop at the crib and sit down, his tail flicking rapidly, something felt wrong. There was a tension in the air, a sense of urgency that was out of place in the otherwise calm home. That's when she noticed it. Emma's breathing was shallow, too shallow. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she dropped the laundry and rushed to the crib. Her baby girl, usually so steady, seemed to be struggling. Emma's chest rose and fell with labored breaths, and her little face was flushed with color. Whiskers, sensing the danger before anyone else, began to meow loudly, sharp, urgent cries that echoed through the house. It was unlike anything Emily had ever heard from him. His cries were desperate, insistent. It was as if he knew that something was terribly wrong, and he needed everyone to act. Without thinking, Emily rushed to Emma's side. She checked the monitor. It wasn't giving an accurate reading. Panic began to rise in her chest as she carefully picked up Emma and cradled her in her arms. The baby's breaths were coming slower now, and Emily's mind raced. She remembered the steps from the emergency training. The phone in her hand felt heavy as she dialed for help. The paramedics arrived moments later, and with their expertise, they stabilized Emma. The whole time, Whiskers stayed by the crib, his cries subsiding only when he saw Emma was safe again. He had done what he was meant to do. He had warned them. Emily stood there, her heart still pounding, looking at the cat who had saved her daughter's life. The chaos of the emergency felt like a dream. Emily couldn't remember the exact moments leading up to the paramedics arriving, her mind blank with panic and fear. All she could focus on was Emma's tiny form in her arms, her shallow breaths, and the overwhelming feeling that something terrible had been avoided by Whiskers. The paramedics worked quickly, their practiced movements calm and efficient. They checked Emma's vitals and attached monitors to track her heart rate and breathing. Within moments, the tightness in Emily's chest began to loosen. The numbers on the monitor stabilized, and Emma's breathing became less labored, more regular. Emily sat beside the crib, her hands still trembling, as Mark arrived home just in time to see the paramedics finish their work. He looked from the baby to Emily and then to Whiskers, who was now sitting quietly by Emma's side, as if he had never left. His amber and green eyes locked onto Mark's, and for the first time, Mark saw the gravity in the cat's gaze. "He saved her," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse from fear. Whiskers, he knew. Mark looked down at their cat. Whiskers didn't purr or meow. He simply sat there, his posture relaxed, yet there was a calm certainty in his presence. It was as if the cat had done exactly what he had been meant to do, alert them in a moment of danger. The paramedics gave their instructions, leaving a prescription for some emergency medication and reminding the Johnsons to follow up with the specialists. As they prepared to leave, one of the paramedics turned to Emily. "You're lucky," she said. "This could have ended very differently if you hadn't caught it in time." "I know," Emily replied softly. "We're lucky." As the ambulance pulled away, leaving the street to return to its quiet normalcy, Emily stood in the living room, still in shock. Her gaze wandered to Whiskers, who had returned to his usual spot by the window, watching the rain with quiet detachment. But in that moment, Emily understood. Whiskers hadn't just been a comforting presence or a silent observer. He had been her daughter's guardian, watching, waiting, sensing the unspoken danger before anyone else. It wasn't just instinct. It was something deeper, something only the two of them could understand. In the stillness of the house, Emily allowed herself a single tear to fall. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't in weeks: gratitude and a glimmer of hope. The news of what happened in the Johnson home spread like wildfire. It was a story too extraordinary to ignore. An ordinary cat, a paralyzed baby, and a life saved in a moment of panic. Whiskers became an overnight hero. It all started with a phone call from a local news station. A reporter had caught wind of the story through one of the paramedics, who had been moved by what had transpired. They wanted to interview Emily, Mark, and the cat who had become the family's unexpected guardian angel. At first, Emily was reluctant. They had only just gotten through the traumatic event, and the idea of sharing such a deeply personal moment with the world felt overwhelming. But as Mark gently reminded her, this wasn't just their story anymore. It was a story of hope, of the unspoken connection between a child and a pet, and of a miracle that no one saw coming. The interview took place in their living room, with Whiskers lounging on the couch as if he was used to the attention. The reporter asked questions about Emma's condition, about Whiskers' unusual behavior, and about the moment Emily realized something was wrong. As the camera rolled, Emily spoke softly, still a bit shaken but grateful for the opportunity to share what had happened. Mark spoke too, his voice steady, but there was an emotion behind his words. "We've always known that animals have this incredible way of connecting with us," he said, his eyes moving toward Whiskers. "But we never imagined he would be the one to save our daughter." The story spread across social media platforms, picked up by websites, newspapers, and TV stations. Comments poured in from people around the world, many of whom were touched by the idea of a cat saving a child's life. There were stories shared of other animals who had saved lives. Dogs, birds, even horses. But Whiskers was different. He wasn't a dog trained to detect danger or a service animal trained to respond to medical needs. He was just a cat, a simple, quiet cat with a deep sense of intuition. For Emily and Mark, it was both overwhelming and humbling. They received messages from strangers, from people who had never met them, but who had been moved by Whiskers' story. Some offered their support, others their admiration for the bond they shared as a family. But as much as the world marveled at the story, for Emily and Mark, it was personal. Whiskers had done more than save Emma's life. He had given them hope in a time when it seemed so hard to find. And in that moment, they knew that Whiskers would never just be a pet. He was family. As the months passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for the Johnson family. Emma's condition remained the same, fragile, unpredictable. But with every passing day, her parents learned to embrace the small victories. A smile, a giggle, the way her eyes would brighten whenever Whiskers entered the room. The world, however, hadn't forgotten about Whiskers. He remained a local hero, his story told and retold in news outlets and shared across social media. People often asked Emily and Mark if they ever felt overwhelmed by the attention. But the truth was, the attention didn't matter as much as the quiet moments they shared with Whiskers. those moments when it was just the three of them, living in the simplicity of love and gratitude. Whiskers, for all the fame he had unknowingly acquired, remained unchanged. He still spent his days by Emma's crib, curling up beside her whenever she rested. He still walked through the house with that calm, deliberate stride, always watching, always aware. It was clear to Emily and Mark that Whiskers knew his purpose, and he never faltered from it. It wasn't just that he had saved Emma once. It was that every day, he offered her a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. He was always there, a steady presence in a world that often felt uncertain. One evening, as the sun set and the soft glow of dusk filled the room, Emily sat in the living room holding Emma in her arms. Whiskers was perched on the arm of the couch, watching the two of them with his familiar, quiet gaze. "Do you ever think about how all of this happened?" Emily asked Mark, her voice soft. "How Whiskers just knew. How he was there when we needed him most." Mark looked over at the cat, his expression filled with wonder. "I don't know, but I think he's always been meant to be here. For her. For us." There was a quiet certainty in his words. In that moment, it became clear. Whiskers was more than just a pet. He was a guardian, a silent protector, a constant companion. He had been there through the most difficult moments, and he would continue to be there for however long he was needed. The Johnson family may have faced challenges, but with Whiskers by their side, they had found something even more valuable than hope. They had found an unspoken promise. A promise that they would never have to face life's challenges alone, no matter how hard or uncertain the road ahead might be. And in the quiet of the evening, with Whiskers curled up beside Emma, the world felt a little less heavy.